A Luftwaffe radio operator named Klaus Brenner arrived at Camp Crossville in Tennessee expecting punishment, interrogation, maybe worse. What he found instead was something that shattered everything he'd been told about the enemy, a recreation hall where German prisoners gathered each evening to listen to American radio shows, laughing at Jack Benny, humming along to Glenn Miller, and debating the plot twists of soap operas broadcast in perfect German. Within weeks, men who'd flown bombing missions over London were lining up to hear the Lone Ranger, transcribing jazz arrangements, and writing letters home describing a nation so confident in its victory that it entertained its captives with comedy hours and symphony broadcasts. The propaganda machine had promised them a weak, fractured America on the brink of collapse. Instead, they discovered a country that could afford to give its prisoners culture, laughter, and a window into a world where abundance wasn't rationed and morale didn't need to be enforced at gunpoint. This wasn't surrender through force. It was surrender through frequency modulation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Klaus Brenner had been a communications specialist with the 3rd Air Fleet, a man who lived inside headphones and spent his nights listening to static encoded transmissions. He knew radio the way a priest knows scripture, every frequency, every crackle of interference, every ghost signal bouncing off the ionosphere. When his junkers went down over the Atlantic in the spring of 1943, ejecting into cold water with nothing but a life vest and a prayer, he figured his war was finished. The American destroyer that fished him out 3 hours later handed him a wool blanket and a mug of coffee so hot it burned his throat. No one hit him. No one spat. The sailors barely looked at him, just another job, another enemy plucked from the sea. The voyage to New York took 11 days. Below deck, Klaus shared a converted cargo hold with 30 other German airmen, submariners, and a few unlucky paratroopers who'd missed their drop zones in North Africa. They slept on cots bolted to the floor, ate canned stew twice a day, and spent their hours playing cards or staring at the riveted steel walls. Some men talked about escape, about what they'd do if they ever saw home again. Others said nothing at all, faces turned to the bulkhead, processing the fact that the war had moved on without them. Klaus kept to himself mostly, listening to the hum of the ship's engines, the rhythmic thump of propellers, the distant voices of American crew members laughing somewhere above. He couldn't help it. Even without equipment, his ears tracked every sound, cataloging, analyzing, searching for meaning in the noise. When they docked, the prisoners were loaded onto a train. It was nothing like the cattle cars Klaus had heard whispered about in other contexts, other wars. These were passenger coaches, worn but functional, with bench seats and windows that opened to let in the humid summer air. Guards sat at each end of the car, rifles resting casually across their laps, but they didn't bark orders or prowl the aisles. One of them, a kid from Ohio with red hair and freckles, offered Klaus a cigarette through the bars of the door. Klaus took it, surprised by the gesture, and smoked it slowly as the train rolled south through Virginia, past green hills and small towns where children waved from dirt roads. Camp Crossville sat in the Cumberland Plateau, surrounded by dense oak forests and the kind of quiet that felt almost alien after years of airfield noise and flak bursts. The gate was just a wooden frame with a sign and a guardhouse, no towers, no searchlights. Inside, rows of wooden barracks stretched out in neat lines, each one painted the same dull green. There was a mess hall, a latrine block, an administration building, and in the center of it all, a large structure with a pitched roof and wide windows that someone said used to be a community hall before the war. Klaus noticed it immediately, not because of its size, but because music was drifting out of it, faint but unmistakable. Swing music. American swing. The intake process was brisk and impersonal. They handed over their sold bucks, their paybooks, answered questions about rank and unit, and received camp identification tags. A sergeant with a clipboard explained the rules in slow, careful German. No fighting. No attempting escape. Work details were voluntary but came with extra privileges. Lights out at 10. Mail could be sent once a week, censored but delivered. And then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned the recreation hall. Open every evening from 6 to 9. Radio broadcasts, phonograph records, newspapers, even a small library. Klaus blinked. He'd expected confinement, not a community center. That first night, exhausted and disoriented, he skipped the hall and went straight to his bunk. The barracks smelled of fresh pine and disinfectant, 60 men crammed into a space meant for fewer, but the mattresses were stuffed with something soft, and the blankets were thick. Around him, men unpacked what little they had, arranged photos on the shelves above their beds, or simply lay staring at the ceiling. Someone near the stove was crying quietly. Another man hummed a tune Klaus didn't recognize. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his mind kept circling back to that music he'd heard, the way it had floated so casually across the camp, as if war were just a distant memory instead of the present tense. The next evening, curiosity got the better of him. After the evening meal, a bland but filling combination of pork, beans, and cornbread, Klaus followed a group of men toward the recreation hall. Inside, the space was larger than he'd expected, with a high ceiling and rows of wooden benches facing a small stage at the far end. A phonograph sat on a table near the door, and against one wall, a massive radio console, the kind Klaus had only seen in command posts, hummed softly. 30 or 40 prisoners were already there, some reading, some playing chess, others just sitting and listening as a broadcast crackled to life. The voice that came through the speaker was smooth, American, and entirely too cheerful. It introduced a program called Fibber McGee and Molly, a comedy show Klaus had never heard of but that apparently half the room found hilarious. The dialogue was rapid, full of puns and misunderstandings, and even though Klaus's English was decent, he struggled to keep up. But the laughter around him was infectious. Men who'd been silent in the barracks were slapping their knees, elbowing each other, repeating the best lines in broken English. One prisoner, a mechanic named Dieter, leaned over and translated the jokes in real time, his face lit up with genuine amusement. Klaus sat down on a bench near the back, bewildered. This wasn't what he'd imagined captivity would be. There was no propaganda blaring from the speakers, no forced marches, no interrogations in windowless rooms. Just a radio show about a bumbling husband and his infinitely patient wife, broadcast to an audience of enemy soldiers who laughed like they were sitting in a living room back home. When the show ended, the dial was turned, and music filled the hall. Big band jazz, the kind that made Klaus think of smoky clubs and late nights, though he'd never been to either. A few men stood and began to dance, awkward but earnest, moving to the rhythm as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He stayed for 2 hours that first night, just watching, listening, trying to understand what this place was. When the hall finally closed and the prisoners filed back to their barracks, Klaus walked slowly, his mind buzzing. He'd been trained to see Americans as soft, decadent, a people too comfortable to fight a real war. But this casual generosity, this willingness to share culture and entertainment with men who'd been trying to kill them months ago, felt like something else entirely. It felt like confidence. Like a country so sure of its victory that it didn't need to withhold anything, not even joy. The next morning, Klaus volunteered for a work detail. Not because he needed the money, though the camp script they paid was useful, but because he wanted to see more, to test the limits of this strange new reality. He was assigned to a crew repairing fences along the perimeter, simple labor that left his hands blistered but his mind free to wander. The guards who supervised them were farmers' sons from Kentucky and Tennessee, boys who talked about baseball and weather and seemed utterly uninterested in ideology. One of them, a lanky private named Carter, shared his lunch with Klaus, a sandwich so thick with ham and cheese that it barely fit in one hand. Klaus ate it slowly, savoring every bite, and tried not to think about the rations he'd eaten during his last winter in Germany. By the end of the week, the recreation hall had become Klaus's nightly ritual. He learned that the camp received broadcasts from all over, national networks piped in through a system the army had installed specifically for prisoner morale. There were news programs, carefully edited to avoid operational details, and music shows that ranged from classical symphonies to the latest hits from the Andrews Sisters. On Thursdays, there was a drama serial called The Shadow, a detective story so gripping that the entire hall fell silent during the climactic scenes. Klaus found himself leaning forward, heart pounding, as the hero confronted the villain in a warehouse full of stolen gold. But it was the German-language broadcasts that really stunned him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Twice a week, the camp received recordings from the Office of War Information, programs specifically produced for German prisoners. They weren't crude propaganda, no heavy-handed lectures about democracy or freedom. Instead, they were variety shows, blending music, comedy sketches, and interviews with German immigrants who'd made new lives in America. One episode featured a former Berlin cabaret singer performing songs from the Weimar era, her voice rich with nostalgia and defiance. Another had a panel discussion about literature, with prisoners from other camps calling in to debate the merits of Goethe versus Schiller. Klaus listened, fascinated. The production quality was flawless, better than anything he'd heard on German state radio in years. The scripts were witty, the music selections impeccable, and the underlying message was delivered so subtly that it took him days to fully grasp it. These programs weren't trying to convert anyone. They were simply showing, through entertainment, that German culture could thrive in America, that the language, the art, the intellectual traditions, all of it had a place in this vast, chaotic country. It was a kind of psychological warfare Klaus had never encountered, one that didn't attack but instead invited, offering a vision of what life could be without the constant weight of ideology. He started taking notes. Old habits die hard, and Klaus couldn't help but analyze what he heard, breaking down the structure of each program, the pacing, the transitions. He noticed how the comedy shows always ended on an upbeat note, leaving the audience smiling. He saw how the music programs mixed familiar German folk songs with American standards, creating a bridge between two cultures. And he realized, slowly, that this wasn't accidental. Every broadcast was calibrated, designed to erode the certainties that had kept men like him loyal to a cause that was crumbling on every front. One night, after a particularly moving broadcast of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, performed by the New York Philharmonic, Klaus struck up a conversation with a fellow prisoner named Otto. Otto had been a schoolteacher in Hamburg, a quiet man with wire-rimmed glasses and a habit of quoting poetry at odd moments. They sat on the steps outside the recreation hall, the Tennessee night air thick and warm, and talked about what they were hearing. Otto said he'd given up trying to reconcile it. The America they'd been taught to despise didn't exist, or if it did, it was buried under something much larger and more complex. He'd received a letter from his wife the week before, smuggled through neutral channels, describing the bombing raids over Hamburg, the food shortages, the children being evacuated to the countryside. And here he was, listening to symphonies and eating 3 meals a day, safe behind barbed wire while his family starved. The guilt was crushing, but so was the realization that maybe, just maybe, they'd been lied to about everything. Klaus didn't know what to say to that. He thought about his own family, his parents in Munich, his younger sister who'd been conscripted into a munitions factory. He thought about the radio transmissions he'd intercepted during his time in the Luftwaffe, the frantic calls for reinforcements, the bombers that never returned. And he thought about the laughter in the recreation hall, the way men who'd been enemies now sat together, united by nothing more than a shared love of a good joke or a well-played tune. The camp library, tucked into a corner of the recreation hall, became another refuge. It was small, maybe 300 books, half in German and half in English, donated by churches and civic groups across America. Klaus devoured them, starting with translations of American authors he'd never been allowed to read. Steinbeck, Hemingway, Mark Twain. The stories were raw, unpolished compared to the literature he'd grown up with, but they had a vitality that felt almost physical. He borrowed a copy of The Grapes of Wrath and read it in 3 days, staying up past lights out with a smuggled flashlight, absorbed in the Jode family's desperate journey across a country that kept breaking their hearts and still, somehow, held the promise of something better. During the day, work details took him out of the camp and into the surrounding countryside. The army had contracts with local farms, and prisoners were leased out to help with the harvest. Klaus spent a week picking tomatoes on a farm owned by a man named Henderson, a grizzled veteran of the First War who treated the German workers with a gruff fairness. Henderson's wife packed lunches for everyone, sandwiches and apples and jars of cold lemonade, and at the end of each day, she'd come out to the field and hand out slices of pie. Klaus had never tasted anything like it, sweet and tart and still warm from the oven. Henderson didn't talk much, but one afternoon, as they loaded crates onto a truck, he asked Klaus what he'd done before the war. Klaus explained about the radio work, the training, the missions. Henderson nodded, then told him about his own service in France, the trenches, the gas attacks, the friends who never came home. He said he didn't hold grudges. Wars were fought by old men who sent young men to die, and the young men were just trying to survive. It was a simple philosophy, maybe too simple, but it lodged itself in Klaus's mind and stayed there. Back at camp, the evenings grew cooler as summer faded into fall. The recreation hall added a new program to the schedule, a weekly talent show where prisoners could perform. Some men sang, others told jokes, and a few enterprising souls put together a small jazz band using instruments donated by a church group in Nashville. Klaus didn't perform, but he helped with the technical side, setting up the microphone, adjusting the amplifier, making sure the sound was clean. It felt good to be useful again, to work with equipment he understood. The jazz band became a sensation. They called themselves Die Swingmeisters, a cheeky nod to the regime's hatred of jazz, and they played every Saturday night to a packed hall. Their renditions of In the Mood and Sing 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 were rough but enthusiastic, and the audience didn't care about the missed notes or the occasional timing issues. They clapped along, stomped their feet, and for 2 hours every week, the war ceased to exist. Klaus stood at the back, monitoring the sound levels, and watched as men who'd been strangers a few months ago now moved as a unit, connected by rhythm and melody. It was during one of these performances that Klaus met an American officer named Lieutenant Harmon. Harmon was in charge of the camp's recreation programs, a soft-spoken man in his 40s who'd been a music teacher before the war. He'd noticed Klaus's work with the equipment and approached him after the show, asking if he'd be interested in helping with the radio broadcasts. The camp was planning to produce its own programs, he explained, recorded shows that could be shared with other camps. They needed someone who understood radio, who could handle the technical side. The pay would be better, and the work would be indoors. Klaus accepted immediately. The new job meant longer hours but also more access to the equipment, and for the first time since his capture, he felt a sense of purpose. The recording setup was basic but functional, a ribbon microphone, a reel-to-reel tape machine, and a small mixing board. Harmon taught him how to edit tape, cutting and splicing segments to remove mistakes or dead air. It was painstaking work, but Klaus loved it, the precision, the control, the way you could shape sound into something meaningful. Their first production was a variety show, a 30-minute program featuring music from Die Swingmeisters, a comedy sketch written by Otto, and a short interview with a prisoner who'd been a journalist in Berlin. They recorded it over 3 nights, working late into the evening, and when they finally played it back, Klaus was surprised by how professional it sounded. Harmon grinned and said they'd send copies to camps in Oklahoma, Texas, and Georgia. Within a month, they'd produced 4 more shows, each one more ambitious than the last. Klaus began writing scripts. It started small, just a few jokes for the comedy segments, but Harmon encouraged him to expand. Soon, Klaus was drafting entire episodes, structuring the pacing, choosing the music, deciding which stories to tell. He interviewed other prisoners, asking about their lives before the war, their hopes, their regrets. One man, a baker from Stuttgart, described his small shop, the smell of fresh bread, the customers who'd come in every morning for rolls and coffee. Another, a university student, talked about the books he'd read, the professors who'd inspired him, the dreams he'd had before everything fell apart. These stories became the heart of the programs. Klaus wove them together with music and humor, creating a tapestry of voices that felt both intensely personal and universally relatable. The feedback was overwhelming. Letters arrived from other camps, prisoners writing to say how much the shows meant to them, how they'd laughed or cried or simply felt less alone. One letter, from a submariner in a camp in Louisiana, said the programs reminded him that he was still human, still capable of feeling something other than fear and exhaustion. As the months passed, Klaus noticed changes in the camp. The initial shock of captivity had worn off, replaced by a strange kind of normalcy. Men established routines, formed friendships, found ways to pass the time. The recreation hall became a social hub, a place where prisoners gathered not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The radio, once just background noise, now served as a lifeline, connecting them to a world beyond the wire, reminding them that culture, art, and laughter still existed even in the middle of a war. But it wasn't all light and music. There were darker moments, times when the reality of their situation crashed back in. News of the Allied advance reached the camp through carefully edited broadcasts, and with each victory, the mood grew more complicated. Some men cheered, relieved that the war might finally end. Others grew silent, processing the fact that their homeland was being destroyed, their cities reduced to rubble. Klaus tried not to think about Munich, about what might be happening to his family, but the worry gnawed at him, a constant presence he couldn't ignore. One night, a prisoner named Franz, a former panzer commander, stood up during a radio program and started shouting. He called the broadcasts lies, propaganda designed to break their spirits. He accused the men who participated in the shows of betrayal, of collaboration with the enemy. The hall went quiet, tension crackling like static. Harman stepped forward, calm but firm, and asked Franz to leave. Franz refused, his face red, fists clenched. For a moment, Klaus thought there might be violence. But then Otto stood, walked over to Franz, and put a hand on his shoulder. He spoke quietly, too low for Klaus to hear, but whatever he said seemed to diffuse the situation. Franz left, shoulders slumped, and the program resumed. Later, Klaus asked Otto what he'd said. Otto shrugged. He told Franz that anger wouldn't change anything, that they were here, caught in something beyond their control, and they could either spend their days consumed by bitterness or they could find moments of peace where they could. Franz had nodded, Otto said, and walked away. Klaus thought about that conversation for days, about the choice it represented. Survival wasn't just physical. It was emotional, mental, a constant negotiation between despair and hope. The camp newspaper, a mimeographed sheet produced weekly by a team of prisoners, started running stories about the radio programs. They interviewed Die Swingmeisters, profiled the men who worked on the technical side, and even published transcripts of some of the comedy sketches. Klaus contributed a column about the history of radio, tracing its evolution from Marconi to the present, and was surprised by how many men wrote to him afterward, sharing their own memories of listening to broadcasts before the war. It became clear that radio, for this community of displaced men, was more than entertainment. It was a bridge to the past, a reminder of who they'd been before uniforms and orders and the weight of ideology. As winter set in, the recreation hall added a new tradition. Every Sunday evening, they broadcast a classical music program, an hour of uninterrupted symphonies, concertos, and chamber pieces. Klaus curated the selections, choosing works by German composers, Bach, Brahms, Wagner, but also including pieces by Americans like Copland and Gershwin. The mix was deliberate, a way of showing that music transcended borders, that beauty didn't belong to any one nation. The response was profound. Men who rarely spoke, who kept to themselves, would sit in the hall with their eyes closed, transported by the music, their faces softened by something that looked almost like grace. Lieutenant Harman became more than just a supervisor. He and Klaus developed a friendship, unlikely but genuine, built on their shared love of radio and their belief in its power to connect people. Harman talked about his life before the war, teaching music in a small town in Pennsylvania, the students who couldn't carry a tune but tried anyway, the concerts they'd put on in the high school auditorium. He said he'd been drafted reluctantly, unsure how his skills would be useful, but now he felt like he was doing something meaningful. Klaus listened, absorbing the idea that even in war, there were ways to build instead of destroy. One evening, Harman brought in a recording that had just arrived from Washington. It was a program produced by the Office of War Information, featuring interviews with German prisoners who'd been in America for over a year. They talked about their experiences, the shock of abundance, the kindness of strangers, the slow process of unlearning the lies they'd been told. One man, a former officer, described visiting a public library during a supervised outing and being overwhelmed by the sheer number of books, the fact that anyone could walk in and read whatever they wanted. Another talked about watching a baseball game and realizing that Americans weren't weak or decadent, they were just different, their strength expressed through community and optimism rather than martial discipline. Klaus played the recording for the camp that night, and the room was silent throughout. When it ended, no one moved for a long moment. Then, slowly, men began to talk, sharing their own observations, their own moments of realization. The conversations went on for hours, spilling out of the recreation hall and into the barracks, and Klaus knew that something had shifted. The war, for these men, was no longer just a military conflict. It was a philosophical one, a struggle to reconcile what they'd been taught with what they were experiencing. By the time spring arrived, Klaus had been at Camp Crossville for over a year. The recreation hall had become his home, the radio programs his purpose. He'd stopped thinking about escape, stopped dreaming of returning to Germany. Not because he didn't care, but because the Germany he'd known no longer existed, and the Germany that was emerging from the rubble of war felt like a stranger. America, for all its flaws and contradictions, had given him something unexpected, a sense of possibility, a belief that the future didn't have to be defined by the past. The war in Europe ended in May, and the news reached the camp through a special broadcast. Men gathered in the recreation hall, listening as the announcer described the surrender, the end of hostilities, the beginning of whatever came next. Some wept. Others cheered. Klaus sat quietly, hands folded, trying to process the magnitude of it. His war had ended long before this moment, the day he climbed out of the Atlantic and accepted a cup of coffee from an enemy who didn't treat him like one. But this official conclusion, felt like a door closing, and he wasn't sure what lay on the other side. In the weeks that followed, the camp buzzed with talk of repatriation, of going home. But home was complicated now. Letters from Germany described cities in ruins, families scattered, and economy shattered beyond recognition. Some men were eager to return, to rebuild, to see their loved ones. Others hesitated, uncertain, afraid of what they'd find. Klaus was among the uncertain. He'd received one letter from his sister, smuggled through the Red Cross, saying that their parents had survived the bombing but their house was gone. She was living in a displaced persons camp, waiting for permission to travel. The thought of seeing her again filled him with longing and dread in equal measure. The radio programs continued, even as the camp's population began to shrink. Men were processed out in waves, loaded onto trains bound for ports where ships waited to carry them across the ocean. Klaus stayed, volunteering to help with the final broadcasts, unwilling to let go just yet. He recorded a special series of programs designed to help returning prisoners adjust to civilian life, interviews with psychologists, advice on finding work, stories from men who'd already made the transition. It was practical, necessary, but it also felt like a goodbye, a final gift to the community that had sustained him. Lieutenant Harmon offered Klaus a job. Not officially, since the war was over and regulations were changing, but he said there were opportunities for men with technical skills, radio stations looking for engineers, schools needing instructors. Klaus considered it, the idea of staying in America, of building a life here. But in the end, he declined. His place was with his family, with the broken country that needed rebuilding. He'd learned a lot in Camp Crossville, about resilience, about the power of culture, about the possibility of change. Now it was time to take those lessons home. His last night in the recreation hall, Klaus recorded a final message. He thanked everyone, the prisoners who'd shared their stories, the Americans who'd treated them with unexpected decency, and Harmon, who'd believed in the power of radio to heal. He said he didn't know what the future held, but he knew that the connections forged here, through music and laughter and shared humanity, would last. When he finished, he turned off the equipment, packed his few belongings, and walked out into the Tennessee night one last time, carrying with him the memory of voices transmitted across the wire, bridging the gap between enemies and reminding everyone who listened that even in the darkest times, there was still room for joy. The boxcar doors slammed shut with a sound like a coffin being sealed. Inside, 60 Soviet prisoners stood shoulder to shoulder in darkness so complete that men lost track of where their own bodies ended and others began. The train lurched forward, beginning its journey east toward camps that would make captivity feel like a luxury reserved for the fortunate. There were no benches, no windows that opened, no bucket that could handle the needs of so many men trapped for days without relief. The air turned toxic within hours, a mixture of sweat, urine, and the particular smell of fear that comes when hope has been systematically removed. A Red Army lieutenant named Sergei Volkov had been captured near Stalingrad, separated from his unit during a German counteroffensive that swept through their positions like a harvesting blade. He'd expected death, maybe torture, certainly brutality. What he got instead was something more calculated, a system designed not to kill quickly but to strip away humanity one layer at a time. The German guards at the collection point had sorted prisoners with clinical efficiency, officers to one side, enlisted men to another, commissars pulled out for immediate execution. Sergei had torn off his rank insignia before they reached him, gambling that anonymity might buy him survival. The journey took 9 days. Water came once every 24 hours, poured through a crack in the door into whatever containers men could fashion from their hands. Food was black bread thrown in like scraps to animals, hard enough to crack teeth, moldy enough to make stomachs revolt. Sergei rationed his portion, eating only what he needed to stay conscious, saving the rest in his pockets for when things got worse. Because they always got worse. Around him, men died standing up, bodies held upright by the press of living flesh, discovered only when the train stopped and the guards ordered everyone out. Camp 326 near Minsk had been a Soviet barracks before the invasion, now repurposed with German efficiency into a holding pen for the inconvenient. There were no barracks anymore, just open ground surrounded by wire and guard towers, places where men were expected to dig their own shelters or freeze when winter came. The daily ration was listed on a board near the gate: 300 grams of bread, watery soup made from potato peelings, sometimes a scrap of fat or bone if the kitchen staff felt generous. It added up to maybe 800 calories on a good day, half that when supplies ran short. Men were expected to work regardless, hauling timber, digging trenches, building roads that would carry German troops deeper into Soviet territory. Sergei learned the rules fast. Never volunteer for anything. Never draw attention. Never show weakness to the POWs, the prisoner functionaries who ran the internal hierarchy with fists and clubs. The Germans had a talent for finding the worst elements among the captives, men who'd trade their souls for an extra slice of bread, and elevating them to positions of power. These POWs were more dangerous than the guards, because they understood the prisoners' desperation and knew exactly how to exploit it. They controlled who got extra rations, who worked the easy details, who disappeared during the night roll calls. There was no radio in Camp 326. No recreation hall, no library, no concerts or comedy shows to distract from the grinding reality of each day. Entertainment was a luxury reserved for those the Germans considered human. Soviet prisoners, designated as subhuman by official policy, were afforded nothing beyond the minimum required to extract labor. Some men sang quietly in their shelters at night, old folk songs from villages they'd never see again, but the guards would beat anyone caught making too much noise. Silence became the dominant sound, broken only by coughing, the shuffle of wooden clogs on frozen ground, and the occasional scream from the punishment barracks. Winter arrived in November and stayed until April, temperatures dropping to -30 on the worst nights. Sergei's shelter was a hole in the ground covered with branches and dirt, shared with 7 other men who huddled together for warmth. They took turns sleeping in the center where body heat concentrated, rotating positions every few hours in a system that kept everyone from freezing but no one comfortable. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes with casual inevitability. Men woke to find their extremities blackened, dead tissue that would eventually fall off if infection didn't kill them first. The death rate that winter exceeded 40%. Bodies piled up near the gate, frozen solid, waiting for spring when the ground would soften enough to dig mass graves. Sergei survived by becoming invisible, keeping his head down, doing exactly what was required and nothing more. He learned to ignore the smell, the sights, the sounds of men losing their minds or their lives. Compassion was a weight he couldn't afford to carry. Every calorie of energy had to be hoarded for himself, every moment of warmth stolen from the collective cold. The weak died first, then the kind, then everyone in between until only the most ruthless remained. There were no letters from home. Soviet prisoners received nothing, no Red Cross packages, no mail service, no acknowledgement that they still existed in any official capacity. Stalin had declared that any soldier who allowed himself to be captured was a traitor, which meant their families back home would be punished, stripped of rations, evicted from housing, marked as relatives of enemies. Sergei thought about his wife and daughter in Moscow, wondered if they were still alive, if they thought he was dead. He wrote letters in his head, composing sentences he'd never send, telling them about the sky over the camp, the way frost made patterns on the wire, anything but the truth of what he endured. By spring, Sergei had been reduced to something barely recognizable as the man who'd entered the camp. His weight had dropped by 40 pounds, ribs visible through skin stretched tight, cheekbones sharp enough to cut. His teeth had loosened from scurvy, gums bleeding at the slightest pressure. But he was alive, which was more than could be said for most of the men who'd arrived with him. The Germans came through periodically, selecting prisoners for transport to labor camps in the Reich, factories that needed workers who could be worked to death without consequence. Sergei was chosen, loaded onto another train, and sent west. The factory was in the Ruhr Valley, a massive complex that produced munitions around the clock. Sergei worked 12-hour shifts operating a press that stamped out shell casings, dangerous work that claimed fingers or hands if you weren't careful. The rations were slightly better here, enough to keep workers functional if not healthy, and there was a roof overhead instead of open sky. But the pace was brutal, the quotas impossible, and the guards shot anyone who collapsed on the factory floor. Sergei lasted 6 months before dysentery laid him out, too weak to stand, let alone work. They sent him to a recovery barracks, a euphemism for a place where the dying went to finish the job away from productive workers. Sergei lay on a wooden shelf that served as a bed, surrounded by men in various stages of decay, and waited. No doctor came. No medicine was offered. The theory was simple: those strong enough to recover would return to work, everyone else would save the Reich the cost of a bullet. Sergei recovered through sheer stubbornness, refusing to let his body quit when his mind still functioned. When he could walk again, they put him back on the line. Liberation came in April of 1945, American troops overrunning the factory as German forces collapsed. Sergei stood in the yard with hundreds of other prisoners, watching soldiers who looked impossibly clean and well-fed distribute rations and medical supplies. They set up field kitchens, handed out cigarettes, treated wounds that had festered for months. An American medic looked at Sergei's emaciated frame and swore softly, promising hot food and transport to a displaced person's camp. Sergei nodded, too exhausted to feel relief, too numb to process freedom. The displaced person's camp was chaos, thousands of people from dozens of countries trying to figure out where to go next. Sergei learned that he couldn't return to the Soviet Union, that Stalin's order still stood, that former prisoners were being sent to labor camps in Siberia as punishment for their capture. He was trapped in a different kind of limbo now, free but stateless, alive but without a home. He thought about Klaus Brenner sometimes, about the German prisoners who'd been sent to America, who'd eaten well and listened to radio shows while Sergei starved in holes in the ground. The injustice of it burned, but burning required energy he didn't have. Years later, living in a small apartment in Munich under a new name, Sergei would occasionally turn on the radio and listen to music programs. The sound reminded him of everything he'd lost, but also everything he'd survived. He never spoke about the camps, never told his new wife or his children about the years that had been carved out of his life. But sometimes, late at night, he'd sit by the window and wonder about the parallel universes of captivity, how a roll of dice determined whether a man ate or starved, laughed or died, remembered his humanity or had it stripped away entirely. The numbers told part of the story. Of the roughly 5.7 million Soviet prisoners taken by Germany, 3 million died in captivity, a mortality rate of nearly 60%. They died from starvation, disease, exposure, execution, and the systematic neglect of a regime that didn't consider them worthy of life. Meanwhile, German prisoners in American camps enjoyed calorie counts that exceeded what many American civilians received, access to education and entertainment, and treatment that violated none of the Geneva Conventions. The contrast wasn't accidental. It was the difference between societies that valued human life and those that reduced it to a calculation of utility. Sergei Volkov died in 1983, never having returned to the Soviet Union, never having seen his first family again. His story, like millions of others, disappeared into the unmarked graves and forgotten statistics of a war that measured suffering in tonnage and casualties. But the lesson remained, carved into the memories of those who survived. In war, captivity could mean abundance or annihilation, and the difference had nothing to do with courage or loyalty. It was just geography, the accident of which uniform you wore when your war ended and which side had the resources, the will, and the basic decency to remember that prisoners were still human beings. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.